And for more, professor and author of this book right here, Court and Conflict, the Israeli military court system, Lisa Hajjar. There you go, there's the book. Lisa Hajjar is talking to us all the way from California. Lisa, good to see you. So you've said before that Suleiman is the CIA's man in Cairo and that he's long been touted as a presidential successor. Just wanted you to elaborate a bit on that, because we saw that also in Paula's piece as well.
Yes, well, Suleiman took over as the head of the Egyptian equivalent of the CIA, the General Intelligence Services, in 1993. And that's a position he held until 2 weeks ago when he became vice president. In that period, in the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president, and the beginning of al-Qaeda attacks in Egypt and Africa, etc., Suleiman and his institution were very closely aligned with the U.S. government when they originally devised the rendition program, which preceded extraordinary rendition. And so the CIA was involved in kidnapping some al-Qaeda suspects from third countries and transporting them to Egypt and other countries for trial, even in the 1990s. But it was after 9/11 when George Bush established the extraordinary rendition program, which allowed or authorized the CIA to kidnap people from anywhere and either disappear them into CIA secret prisons called black sites or transfer them to third countries. And Egypt was a favorite destination. And in that period, Suleiman was, that was his particular bailiwick in terms of doing America's dirty work. Other countries did too, but Egypt was a major country. And Suleiman has his hands literally dirty in the torture of several people.
And perhaps that's why you refer to him as Egypt's torturer-in-chief. But it's interesting because that's not how the media sort of paints this man. We don't hear much about that aspect of his life.
Well, in fact, Egyptians in Egypt who are not suspected of being, allied with transnational terror are tortured by their own internal security services. So, in fact, there's a great deal of torture that goes on routinely in Egypt that has nothing to do with the institution Suleiman is involved in. However, as far as the international dimension, and particularly during the course of the war on terror, where Egypt has been a torture destination, that's been Suleiman's role.
Lisa, if free and fair elections were held tomorrow in Egypt, who do you think would win?
Well, I certainly don't think it would be Suleiman. For one thing, he doesn't, his legitimacy or his credibility is associated with that of the military, but he's not a particularly popular military leader. And since he's really commanded a great deal of Egyptian and international attention since he was made vice president 2 weeks ago, much of the way in which he's acted has really, I think, displeased or angered Egyptians. He's been nicknamed Mubarak's Mubarak. And so to some extent, he looks very much like someone who would maintain all of the problematic aspects of the regime that the protesters are demonstrating for. So he has no popular base other than the military, and the military would prefer probably someone else. The question is, or Suleiman's real source of influence, perhaps, is the international order, and the fact that Mubarak wanted to appoint someone that would essentially be able to tamp down the protests and maintain the regime during this period.
I had Asia Times correspondent Pepe Escobar on our last show, and he said that the United States fears Arab democracy. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think that the anxieties that are circulating in parts of the media are, based largely on a lack of understanding about the Middle East. But certainly both U.S. media and U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, but not only, have often prioritized stability and the, facilitation of U.S. corporate and governmental interests. So to the extent that Americans fear democracy, it's something that has been conditioned for them by the media and government policy. And I think that they should not be fearing democracy. I mean, we've seen some incredibly heroic, incredibly moving and brave stands that tens and tens of thousands of people have taken to fight for democracy, not going for violence except in self-defense. And this should be an inspiration that encourages Americans to learn a little bit more about the Middle East and to insist that democracy should really guide U.S. foreign policy.
Well, speaking of government policy here, as far as who to support in Egypt, there seems to be bipartisan support here. There's so much partisan politics when it comes to domestic issues, but when it comes to foreign policy, especially Egypt, everyone seems to sort of rally around the same person. Why is that?
Well, I think that, in fact, now what we're seeing with the beginnings of talk, there isn't so much, there's been some support for the end of protests, and Suleiman as perhaps a caretaker ruler while Mubarak perhaps takes a medical leave to Germany. But I actually think that each passing day diminishes the appeal of Suleiman, and he did something very, in some ways, it undermines his credibility as a power broker with the protesters. He organized a meeting 2 days ago with a hand-selected group of people that he wanted to speak with, including members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the people who attended the meeting thought it was a talk to talk about talking. In other words, to set some ground rules for what would be happening. But in fact, immediately after the meeting, he came out and told the Egyptian people on state TV that they'd reached a consensus and that the consensus had essentially been what the government wants, which is protesters go home and everything more or less stays the same. And so people who participated in those talks really, I think, felt had, and that significantly diminishes Suleiman's credibility in Egypt. Suleiman probably will not survive to, beyond September when there's an election. Right. He certainly is unlikely to be a democratically elected president.
It's certainly going to be very interesting to see what happens with Omar Suleiman and his fate in Egypt. Lisa Hajjar, thanks so much for your analysis today.
Thank you, Dina.